Hello friends, welcome and enjoy this creepy story. In the heart of the city, tucked between towering skyscrapers and bustling streets, stood an office building that looked no different from any other. It was a sleek, glass-paneled structure with the name Argent Corporation emblazoned in silver letters above the entrance. Employees came and went every day, just as they did in countless other buildings across the city. Yet, among the workers at Argent, there was a strange rumor, one that everyone seemed to have heard, but no one could quite remember where it originated. The rumor spoke of a hidden floor, one that didn't show up on any elevator panel or building directory. Some called it the Forgotten Floor, a place shrouded in mystery and whispered about in hushed tones. Supposedly, it was located between the 13th and 14th floors, though no one could recall ever actually seeing it. Some claimed that if you stood in the elevator for long enough, pressing nothing but waiting patiently, it might stop there by itself. Others said that you could access it by holding down certain buttons in a specific sequence, a code known only to those who no longer worked in the building, or perhaps had never worked there at all. Despite the intrigue, most dismissed it as nothing more than an urban legend, a ghost story told to pass the time during dull workdays. After all, it was easy to explain away. The building had no 13th floor, as was common in many high-rises due to superstitions. The elevators skipped straight from 12 to 14, and any talk of a hidden floor was surely just a figment of overactive imaginations. But there were those who swore they had heard things, faint whispers or distant echoes coming from somewhere they couldn't quite pinpoint. A few had even reported seeing strange shadows in the stairwells, or lights flickering on and off for no apparent reason. The janitors, who worked late into the night, would sometimes tell stories of feeling watched, as though something unseen lurked just beyond the edge of their vision. For most, these were mere stories, dismissed with a laugh and a shake of the head. But for a few, the idea of the forgotten floor became an obsession, a mystery begging to be solved. Among the latter group was a man named Thomas. He was a mid-level manager at Argent Corporation, well liked by his colleagues and known for his meticulous attention to detail. But there was something about the rumor of the forgotten floor that gnawed at him, something that wouldn't let him rest. Perhaps it was the sheer absurdity of it all, the idea that an entire floor of a building could go unnoticed, unseen, and unremembered by thousands of employees over the years. Or maybe it was the subtle sense of unease that had settled over him since he first heard the tale, an unease that he couldn't quite shake, no matter how much he tried to rationalize it. Thomas wasn't superstitious by nature, but he was curious, and that curiosity slowly grew into an obsession. He found himself thinking about the forgotten floor during meetings, his mind wandering as others droned on about quarterly reports and market projections. He began lingering in the elevator after work, half expecting something to happen, though nothing ever did. He even started to dream about it, vivid and unsettling dreams where he found himself alone in a long, dimly lit corridor, with doors lining both sides and a feeling of something unseen watching him from the shadows. As the weeks passed, Thomas's obsession deepened. He began asking subtle questions around the office, trying to gather more information without arousing suspicion. Most people laughed it off, telling him it was just a silly story, a prank played on new employees to see how gullible they were. But a few offered cryptic responses, as if they knew more than they were willing to share. One night, after a late shift, he cornered one of the janitors, a grizzled old man named Carl who had worked in the building for decades. "The forgotten floor?" Carl said, scratching his stubbly chin. "Heard of it, sure. Everyone has. But you don't want to go poking around where you don't belong, son. Some doors are better left unopened, if you catch my drift." When Thomas pressed him for details, Carl shook his head. "I've been here a long time," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Seen things I can't explain, things that don't make sense. There's something wrong with this building, always has been. I don't know what's on that floor, but I've got a bad feeling about it. If I were you, I'd let it be." But Thomas couldn't let it be. He had to know the truth. Thomas's fixation with the forgotten floor consumed him. He spent hours researching the building, combing through old blueprints, permits, and maintenance records. But there was no mention of an extra floor anywhere. It was as if it had never existed. Frustrated, he turned to the building's elevator system, hoping to find some clue hidden in the schematics or programming. Late one night, after most of his colleagues had gone home, Thomas found himself in the basement, where the building's main electrical systems were housed. The basement was a maze of cables, conduits, and humming machinery, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, and the low hum of the machinery created an eerie, almost oppressive atmosphere. He had convinced the night shift technician, a weary man named Greg, to let him poke around under the guise of a security check. Greg was skeptical but didn't ask too many questions. After all, no one liked spending more time down there than necessary. As Thomas pored over the schematics, he noticed something odd. The elevator system was programmed to skip the 13th floor, just as he'd expected. But there was a subroutine buried deep in the code that caught his attention. It was labeled simply as F13, a seemingly innocuous line of code that didn't appear to do anything. Yet, when Thomas tried to delete or alter it, the entire system threatened to crash. Intrigued, he dug deeper, trying to trace the origin of the subroutine. It had been added years ago, long before his time at Argent, by a programmer whose name he didn't recognize. There was no accompanying documentation, no explanation for its existence. It was as if someone had deliberately hidden it, ensuring that it would go unnoticed by anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Thomas's curiosity grew. He was convinced that this subroutine was the key to accessing the forgotten floor. But how? The more he tried to decipher the code, the more elusive it became, like a puzzle with no solution. That night, as he rode the elevator up to his office, he decided to try something different. He waited until the doors were about to close, then pressed the 12 button repeatedly, followed by the 14 button. Nothing happened. Frustrated, he tried different combinations, pressing buttons in various sequences, but the elevator stubbornly ignored his efforts, stopping only on the floors he selected. As he stood there, the hum of the elevator filling the silence, Thomas began to feel foolish. Maybe this was all just a wild goose chase. Maybe there was no forgotten floor, just a silly story that had gotten out of hand. But then, as the elevator passed the 12th floor, something strange happened. The lights flickered, just for a moment, and the elevator slowed down, as if it were about to stop. But instead of opening its doors, it continued to climb, finally stopping at the 14th floor. Thomas stepped out, his heart pounding. He felt a strange sense of disappointment, mixed with a growing unease. Had he imagined it? Was his mind playing tricks on him? He shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something odd. The numbers above the elevator door, indicating the floor number, flickered for a moment, showing 13 before quickly changing to 14. Thomas stared at the numbers, his pulse quickening. It was as if the elevator had wanted to stop on the 13th floor, but something had forced it to continue. It was a small, almost imperceptible glitch, but it was enough to rekindle his obsession. He decided to try again the next day, this time during the lunch break when the building was relatively empty. But the next day, as he stood in the elevator, he felt a growing sense of dread. What if he did find the forgotten floor? What then? What would he encounter? He pushed those thoughts aside, determined to see this through. This time, he held down the 12 button until the elevator began to move, then quickly pressed 14. As the elevator ascended, the lights flickered again, and the elevator slowed to a stop. The doors slid open, revealing a dark, narrow corridor. The air that wafted in was stale and cold, carrying a faint, musty smell. Thomas hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to close the doors and leave. But his curiosity won out. He stepped into the corridor, and the doors slid shut behind him, leaving him in near darkness. Thomas stood in the dark corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. The only light came from the dim glow of the elevator's floor indicator, which now displayed 13 in flickering digits. The corridor stretched out before him, lined with closed doors on either side. The walls were bare, painted in a dull, off-white color that had yellowed with age. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. He took a tentative step forward, the floor creaking under his weight. The sound echoed down the corridor, making it feel even more empty and foreboding. Thomas glanced back at the elevator, half expecting it to disappear or malfunction, trapping him on this strange, forgotten floor. But the doors remained closed, the flickering 13 taunting him. Gathering his courage, Thomas began to walk down the corridor, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. He passed door after door, each one identical, with no markings or signs to indicate what lay behind them. They all looked old, their paint chipped and peeling, as if they hadn't been touched in years. As he walked, a strange feeling washed over him, a sense of disorientation, as if the corridor was subtly shifting, elongating with each step he took. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, hidden in the shadows just out of sight. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and he had to resist the urge to turn back. But Thomas was determined to see this through. He reached out and grasped the handle of one of the doors, his hand trembling slightly. The metal was cold to the touch, and for a moment, he hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark and silent. Thomas fumbled for a light switch, his fingers brushing against something smooth and cold. He flipped the switch, and a dim, flickering light filled the room, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single desk and chair in the center. Papers and files were scattered across the desk, as if someone had left in a hurry. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of grime. Thomas approached the desk, his eyes scanning the papers. Most of them were old, yellowed with age, and covered in illegible handwriting. But one document caught his eye, a faded blueprint of the building. He picked it up and squinted at it in the dim light, trying to make sense of the markings. To his surprise, the blueprint showed a floor labeled 13, sandwiched between the 12th and 14th floors. It was identical to the layout of the other floors, but there was something off about it, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The rooms were labeled with cryptic codes, and there were strange symbols scrawled in the margins, symbols that sent a shiver down his spine. Thomas felt a growing sense of unease as he studied the blueprint. This floor shouldn't exist, it was a phantom, a glitch in reality. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of it. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the corridor outside the room, followed by the sound of footsteps. Thomas froze, his heart racing. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. He quickly shoved the blueprint into his pocket and turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness. He held his breath, listening intently as the footsteps approached the door. They stopped just outside, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door handle began to turn, slowly, as if someone, or something, was trying to enter. Panic surged through Thomas. He had nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to make himself as small as possible, his mind racing with fear. The door creaked open, and a faint sliver of light spilled into the room. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he waited, every muscle in his body tense. But after a few agonizing seconds, the door stopped moving. The footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Thomas let out a shaky breath, his body trembling with adrenaline. He had to get out of there. Whatever was on this floor, he didn't want to find out. He slipped out of the room and hurried down the corridor, his footsteps silent on the grimy floor. The elevator was just ahead, the number 13 still flickering above the doors. He pressed the button frantically, his eyes darting around the corridor as if expecting something to leap out at him. The door slid open with a soft ding, and Thomas rushed inside, pressing the button for the 14th floor. The elevator doors closed, and he felt a sense of relief wash over him as the elevator began to ascend. But as the elevator climbed, the lights flickered again, and the air grew colder. Thomas glanced at the floor indicator, and his blood ran cold, it was still displaying 13. The elevator wasn't moving. Panic gripped him as he pressed the buttons repeatedly, trying to get the elevator to move. But the more he pressed, the more the lights flickered, until they finally went out, plunging the elevator into complete darkness. Thomas's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he fumbled for his phone, using the dim glow of the screen to illuminate the small space. He was trapped, trapped on a floor that shouldn't exist, in an elevator that refused to take him back to safety. Suddenly, the elevator shuddered, and the lights flickered back on. The floor indicator changed, showing 14 in bright, steady digits. The elevator began to move again, and Thomas felt a wave of relief as it ascended to the 14th floor. Always watching, but never fully seeing. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time Thomas closed his eyes, he saw the corridor from the forgotten floor, stretching out endlessly before him, lined with those identical, unmarked doors. And behind each door, he knew, something waited, something that wanted to be found. He started drinking to numb the fear, to silence the voices in his head that whispered of things better left forgotten. But the alcohol only made things worse. The watchers became more bold, more visible, their shadowy forms taking on more defined shapes. He could see their eyes now, glowing, empty voids that bored into his soul, judging him, condemning him. One night, as he sat in his darkened living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey clutched in his trembling hand, he saw them clearly for the first time. They were standing in the hallway outside his apartment, their tall, gaunt figures silhouetted against the dim light of the street lamp outside. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out across his skin as he stared back at them, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break the silence that had settled over the room like a shroud. But he was frozen, paralyzed by their gaze. And then, without warning, they were gone. The hallway was empty, the only sound the distant hum of the city outside. Thomas blinked, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. Had it been real, or just another trick of his overtaxed mind? But deep down, he knew the truth. The watchers were real, and they were growing bolder. Whatever he had unleashed by stepping onto the forgotten floor, it wasn't going to stop until it had consumed him completely. Thomas knew he couldn't go on like this. The fear, the sleepless nights, the constant sense of being watched, it was driving him to the edge of madness. He needed to confront whatever was happening, to face the forgotten floor head-on and find some way to end the nightmare. He spent days preparing, gathering what little information he could from the building's archives and old maintenance records. He found references to the building's construction, mentions of strange accidents, unexplained disappearances, but nothing concrete. It was as if the truth had been buried, deliberately obscured by layers of bureaucracy and time. Finally, he decided to return to the building after hours, when the office was empty and he wouldn't be disturbed. He packed a bag with supplies, a flashlight, a camera, a notebook, and a few other essentials. He wasn't sure what he would find on the forgotten floor, but he knew he needed to document it, to prove to himself that it was real. As the clock struck midnight, Thomas entered the building, his footsteps echoing through the deserted lobby. The security guard was asleep at his desk, oblivious to Thomas's presence. Thomas headed straight for the elevator, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. He followed the same procedure as before, holding down the 12 button and then pressing 14. The elevator shuddered as it ascended, the lights flickering ominously. This time, when the doors opened, Thomas wasn't surprised to find himself on the forgotten floor. The corridor was just as he remembered it, dark, narrow, and lined with those unmarked doors. But there was something different this time, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The air was colder, the shadows deeper, as if the very fabric of reality was fraying at the edges. Thomas stepped out of the elevator, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He moved cautiously, his senses on high alert, every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the air setting his nerves on edge. He reached the first door and paused, his hand hovering over the handle. The memory of the footsteps and the turning handle flashed through his mind, but he pushed the fear aside. He had come this far, there was no turning back now. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was identical to the one he had seen before, dusty, dimly lit, with a single desk and chair in the center. But this time, there was something else. On the desk, a single, yellowed sheet of paper lay in the center, as if waiting for him. Thomas approached the desk cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the paper. It was covered in strange symbols and markings, similar to the ones he had seen on the blueprint. But there was something different about these symbols, something that made his skin crawl. As he studied the paper, the symbols seemed to shift and move, as if they were alive. The longer he looked at them, the more they seemed to burrow into his mind, filling his thoughts with strange, fragmented images, visions of dark corridors, of shadowy figures, of a door that should never be opened. Thomas shook his head, trying to clear his mind. He needed to stay focused, to understand what the symbols were trying to tell him. But the more he tried to make sense of them, the more his thoughts scattered, slipping through his fingers like sand. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the shadows deepened. The air became thick, oppressive, as if something unseen was pressing down on him. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he realized he was no longer alone. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there, only the empty room, the silent corridor beyond. Yet, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, as if 1,000 eyes were staring at him from the shadows. Thomas felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. He needed to get out of there, to leave the forgotten floor, and never return. But as he turned to the door, he froze. The watchers were there, standing in the corridor, their tall, gaunt figures blocking his escape. Their eyes, glowing, empty voids, bored into him, filling his mind with a deep, primal terror. Thomas stumbled back, his flashlight flickering in his trembling hand. He tried to move, but his legs felt like lead, his body paralyzed by their gaze. The watchers began to move, their movement slow and deliberate, as if they were savoring his fear. Thomas could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the darkness closing in around him. Desperation surged through him, and with a surge of adrenaline, he forced his legs to move. He turned and ran, fleeing deeper into the forgotten floor, the watchers following silently behind him. Thomas ran down the corridor, his flashlight beam shaking as he stumbled over the uneven floor. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows deepening with every step. He could hear the watchers behind him, their footsteps slow and deliberate, as if they knew there was no escape. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breaths came in ragged gasps as he reached the end of the corridor. There, he found a door unlike the others. It was larger, more ornate, with strange symbols carved into the wood. It seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light, as if it was alive. Thomas hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he had no choice. The watchers were closing in, their presence pressing down on him like a weight. He reached out and grasped the door handle, his hand trembling. The handle was cold, almost painfully so, and as he turned it, he felt a strange sensation, a tingling that spread up his arm, filling him with a sense of dread. The door creaked open, revealing a dark void beyond, a blackness so complete that it seemed to swallow the light of his flashlight. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before stepping through the door. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped even further, and a thick, cloying fog enveloped him. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the darkness. He found himself standing on a narrow ledge, overlooking an abyss that stretched out infinitely in every direction. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the distant, mournful sound of wind. Below, the fog swirled like a living thing, hiding whatever lay beneath. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he realized he was no longer in the building. He was in another place, a place that defied logic and reason. The ledge beneath his feet was the only solid ground in a void of nothingness, a sliver of reality in a sea of darkness. He turned back to the door, but it was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. Panic gripped him as he realized he was trapped in this place, with no way out. Suddenly, the fog began to shift, and from the darkness, shapes began to emerge. Tall, shadowy figures, similar to the watchers, but different, larger, more imposing, with eyes that glowed with a malevolent light. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their forms shifting and undulating as they approached. Thomas backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He was trapped, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figures drew closer, their presence overwhelming, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. As they closed in, the fog parted, revealing something in the center of the abyss, a massive, pulsating mass of darkness, its surface writhing with tendrils of shadow. It seemed to breathe, its form expanding and contracting rhythmically, as if it was alive. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out across his skin as he realized what he was seeing. This was the source of the forgotten floor, the entity that had twisted reality and created this place. It was ancient, malevolent, and it had been waiting for him. The shadowy figures encircled Thomas, their eyes fixed on him with a predatory hunger. The mass of darkness pulsed, and from within it, a voice emerged, a voice that echoed in his mind, filling his thoughts with a deep, resonant tone. "You should not have come here," the voice said, each word reverberating through his skull like a hammer. Thomas clutched his head, trying to block out the voice, but it was impossible. It was inside him, invading his mind, filling him with a crushing sense of despair. "This place is mine," the voice continued, its tone dripping with malice. "You are mine." The shadowy figures moved closer, their forms towering over him. Thomas fell to his knees, his strength draining away as the darkness pressed in on him from all sides. He could feel the entity's presence enveloping him, seeping into his very soul. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, a living, breathing force that sought to consume him. But deep within the recesses of his mind, a spark of defiance remained. He couldn't let it end like this. He had come too far, fought too hard to be consumed by this malevolent force. With the last of his strength, Thomas reached into his bag and pulled out the camera. He raised it to his eye and snapped a picture, the flash illuminating the darkness for a brief moment. The light seemed to burn the shadowy figures, causing them to recoil in pain. The entity roared in anger, its voice shaking the very ground beneath him. But Thomas didn't stop. He took another picture, and another, each flash pushing the darkness back, giving him a sliver of hope. But it wasn't enough. The darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. The shadowy figures regrouped, their forms shifting and twisting as they prepared to strike. Thomas felt his strength waning, his vision blurring as the darkness closed in. But just as he was about to give in, to let the darkness consume him, something changed. The camera in his hand began to glow, its light growing brighter with each passing second. The light intensified, pushing back the darkness, burning away the shadowy figures. The entity roared in anger, its form writhing in pain as the light pierced through it. Thomas watched in awe as the light expanded, filling the abyss with a brilliant, blinding radiance. The darkness recoiled, retreating into the void, and for the first time since he had entered this place, Thomas felt a sense of relief. But the light didn't stop. It continued to grow, filling every corner of the void, until there was nothing left but blinding white. Thomas felt a sensation of weightlessness, as if he was floating in a sea of pure light. And then, everything went still. When Thomas opened his eyes, he found himself lying on the floor of his office. The harsh fluorescent lights above flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. His body ached, and his head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. He sat up slowly, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The memory of the forgotten floor, the shadowy figures, the entity, all of it seemed like a distant, fading dream. But the fear, the sense of dread that had gripped him, was still very real. As he looked around, he realized he was alone. The office was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The clock on the wall showed that only a few hours had passed since he had first entered the building. But to Thomas, it felt like a lifetime. He reached for his bag, hoping to find the camera, but it was gone, it vanished, along with the photos he had taken. There was no evidence of what had happened, nothing to prove that he hadn't imagined it all. But Thomas knew the truth. He had faced something beyond comprehension, something that had nearly consumed him. And while he had escaped with his life, he knew he would never be the same. In the days that followed, Thomas tried to return to his normal routine, but the experience had left a deep, indelible mark on him. The watchers were gone, the strange occurrences in his office had ceased, but the memory of the forgotten floor lingered, haunting his thoughts and dreams. He found himself drawn back to the building, staring at the elevator, half expecting the doors to open and reveal the dark corridor beyond. But the elevator worked as it always had, ferrying passengers between the ordinary, mundane floors of the office building. Still, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the forgotten floor was still there, hidden just out of sight, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble upon it. And deep down, he knew that one day, someone would. Because the forgotten floor wasn't just a place, it was a door, a gateway to something far darker, something that existed beyond the bounds of reality. And once that door was opened, it could never be fully closed. Thomas had seen what lay on the other side, and he knew that whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. And one day, it would come back. The story of the forgotten floor spread like wildfire among the employees, becoming the stuff of office legend. Some dismissed it as a ghost story, a product of overactive imaginations and late-night work stress. But others whispered of strange occurrences, of floors that didn't exist, of doors that led to nowhere. And while most people laughed it off, calling it nothing more than a creepy tale to pass the time, Thomas knew better. Because he had been there. He had seen the darkness, faced the watchers, and felt the presence of the entity that lurked in the shadows. And he knew that somewhere, in the depths of that forgotten building, the door to the forgotten floor still existed, waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble upon it. And when they did, the darkness would be waiting, just as it had waited for him. For the forgotten floor was not a place, it was a curse, one that could never be truly escaped. And for those who found it, there would be no turning back. Because some doors, once opened, could never be closed.